This is episode 18 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. Today I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Benjamin Madley, who is an associate professor of history at UCLA. Ben specializes in Native America, the U.S., and colonialism in world history. He has written on the Herero and Nama Genocide in southwest Germany, now known as Namibia, which was Germany's Second Reich, and his latest book is An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873, which is well-researched and thoughtful. I highly recommend this book. Madley's research explains how the genocide of the indigenous population in California was a concerted effort by vigilante state and federal forces. He quotes California Governor Peter Burnett, who stated in 1851 that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. In this discussion, Madley speaks on the Herero and Nama genocide, how he approaches teaching and writing history, the genocide and survival of California Indians, resistance to colonization, intergenerational transmission of trauma, the Civil War, and discuss memorials and reparation for genocide in California. Thanks to Awareness for the music, and here's a short jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
Too busy trying to survive capitalism's daily grind to get caught up on the latest anarchist news? Or maybe you're so wrapped up in your own organizing that it's hard to make time to hear about other liberatory struggles. This Rebel Girl has got you covered. Tune in every Wednesday for new episodes of The Hot Wire, a 30-minute podcast with the latest anarchist news, on-the-ground interviews, a repression roundup, political prisoner birthdays, and announcements for upcoming events. All this and more at crimethink.com.
Too hot. This town is too hot.
First, I'd like to begin with how I came across your work, and I think this story is really important. I was teaching at the Community College of Denver in the Political Science Department, and it was a class on comparative government. And I was given the state textbook and supposed to teach it, and on the first day, the students and I, we went over the textbook. And one of the students, his name was John, he spoke up and said, "Why is the only genocide mentioned in here the Holocaust?" And John, a little bit of background on John, he was from South Sudan. And we opened the discussion to talk about other genocides, such as First Nations people and the indigenous in North America, and King Leopold in Congo. And John told me about the genocide of the Herero and Nama in southwest Germany, which is now known as Namibia, and asked if we could learn about that. So we all brainstormed a new curriculum on the board, and through my colonized education, I had never known of this and started reading about it right away, and I came to your thorough research that documented this genocide that occurred on Shark Island and the concentration camps that Germany was running well before World War II. So I was wondering if you could speak about the lack of attention paid to this genocide and what path this research led you down to for future projects?
Sure. Well, fortunately, I think that we're in a new era where the German Southwest African genocide of Herero and Nama people is concerned, inasmuch as there seems to be a great deal of attention paid to it compared to 1992 when I first started reading about it and had to go mainly to German language texts in order to find material about it. And so part of what has happened is that there has been political and public spotlight thrown on these issues, in part simply by the process of SWAPO making Namibia into an independent country. I think that had a great deal to do with this because they wanted to shine a light on these crimes, on these atrocities. And we can see some of that physically manifest in Namibia today. So, for example, the main street in Windhoek is no longer called Kaiser Wilhelm Strasse. And the big monument to the Schutztruppe in the middle of Windhoek has been removed, and in its place is now a monument to the fallen and to those who resisted the Germans in this period. So for me personally, it was a case of coming across this material as a college student, just hints of it, and then being very interested, really from the very beginning, wondering about the origins of the Holocaust and whether the Holocaust might have some antecedents, some predecessors, some places from which it came. Because, of course, there's a huge amount of scholarship on anti-Semitism, a deep and long history of European hate for Jews and physical attacks on Jews, and the rhetoric, the ideology, and the actual events of assaults. And so there's much less about other contributing factors. If you think about Nazism as a tree of hate, it has many different roots, and this was one that I thought was very worthy of exploration.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, and also how, which was going to be a later question, is the legacy that colonization brings and how it's embedded into cities and cultures after that. And,
right.
It's really important.
I saw a really interesting exhibition recently. It was not a performance art piece exactly, but it was a series of installations. It was videos of monuments being torn down all over Africa, monuments primarily to colonialism. And one of the videos was showing that famous German soldier statue being pulled down in Windhoek. And so, these things are changing. But for me, the real question was, where does the Holocaust come from? And secondly, much as the story you just told me, why don't we know about this first huge genocide of the 20th century? Why did it get buried? And so as the research began, and I really dove into this deeply as a graduate student at Oxford University, studying German history, the thing that really struck me was understanding that some of the really key concepts of the Holocaust, key concepts of Nazi race hate ideology and Nazi imperialism, seem quite clearly to have had their origins in German Southwest Africa. So, for example, I remember just being shocked to see terms like Lebensraum or Konzentrationslager, which means concentration camp.
And living space is the other term.
Yeah, that's Lebensraum.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
We think of these as quintessentially Nazi terms, and then to realize that they were not coined by the Adolf Hitler regime was really surprising to me. And also to see how much earlier they were coined, that they were coined decades earlier. And then to see the unfolding of the story of the Herero and Nama genocides seeming so similar in many ways to the Nazi, not only the plans to conquer and colonize Eastern Europe and enslave and murder billions of Slavs and exterminate every last Jew, but also the actual process. But, I do want to be clear that there were thinkers who really shaped this project. I didn't come up with it on my own. I mean, first of all, I'd read Hannah Arendt, and she, of course, famously postulated in 1951 that European imperialism played a crucial role in the development, foundations of totalitarianism and associated mass murders. Of course, she stopped short of trying to trace a direct connection between Wilhelmine German colonialism and Nazi mass murder and imperialism. But there were others who did go more in that direction. One of them is the scholar Sven Lindqvist. Another is Enzo Traverso. And they were making those connections between colonialism and mass murder. And of course, the German historian Jürgen Simmerer, in his book Colonialism and the Holocaust, really made the direct claim that European colonialism provided important precedents for Nazi genocidal thinking. And he also argued that the German imperial war waged against the Herero and Nama was an important point of connection between the general phenomenon of colonial genocide and the crimes of the Nazis. Another person who's quite important in my thinking, and I think in studying these issues, is the historian Isabel Hull at Cornell, and she's really articulated some of those qualitative similarities between military actions by the German military in German Southwest Africa and the German military in Third Reich imperialism and genocide.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And I'd like to move on now to your book, American Genocide. And, you know, the full title is American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. And I feel a main thesis or point of your book is that it names settler colonialism in the U.S. for what it was, which is full-on genocide, where calls for extermination were made and committed, and your research is meticulous. Can you speak about the implications of your research that shows that genocide was not only committed by vigilantes, but by state government and the federal government, and kind of give a summary of like the foundation of how all those kind of interconnected in California?
Sure. So when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I came across reports of massacres in California, and this connected for me with the stories I'd heard as a boy growing up in a little town called Happy Camp on the Klamath River in far northern California, where Karuk and Shasta people had told me about the killings that took place there. And I'd always wondered if those were localized massacres or if they happened elsewhere in the state. So what I found in the research is that, in general, California's indigenous population plunged from perhaps 150,000 people to just 30,000 survivors between 1846 and 1870. And certainly diseases, dislocation, and starvation caused many of these deaths. But what I found with this was not the near annihilation of a people simply based upon the unavoidable result of two civilizations coming into contact. It was, in fact, genocide sanctioned and facilitated by California officials. So, first of all, we have to talk about what we mean when we use this politically explosive term genocide. And I'm referring very specifically to the definition that is put forth in the UN Genocide Convention of 1948. And so in order for a prosecutor to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they have to prove two things beyond any shadow of a doubt. And the first thing that they have to prove is that the defendant evinced intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And second, they have to prove that the defendant committed at least one of the 5 genocidal acts specified in the convention. And these include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So when people speak about genocide, they're usually speaking about a state-sponsored policy. And when California's first legislature convened in 1850, one of the very first things that it did was to ban all Indians from voting. And then they banned Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from giving evidence for or against whites in most civil and criminal cases, and they denied Indians the right to serve as jurors. And then they banned Indians from serving as attorneys and justices. And so when you think about what that means in combination, these laws largely shut Indian people out of participation in and protection by the state legal system. So this amounted to a virtual grant of impunity to would-be Indian killers. So that's kind of the first stage, and that's similar to some other genocides, that targeted victim groups are denied protection or participation in the legal system and are stripped of any political rights as well. But then the government, in that same year, 1850, legalized unfree Indian labor. And so this led to a truly genocidal slave system. So it had multiple genocidal impacts. First of all, when slave raiders would arrive at a California Indian village, they would typically kill anyone who resisted, anyone who tried to run away, and many of the older men and women. Of the first genocidal part of it was a lot of killing. And then people would be marched away to be sold, and anybody who tried to escape or resisted during that process also was usually killed. And then once people got to the place where they were going to be sold, they were scattered. So it would be very difficult for the community to reproduce itself, either biologically or socially. And finally, when people reached the places where they would work as unfree laborers, they were often treated as disposable and worked to death. And so one lawyer from Los Angeles, where I live, recalled, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its slave mart, and thousands of honest, useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way." And census takers really back that up. Between 1850 and 1870, LA's population fell from 3,693 to just 219 survivors. So slavery played a huge part in this genocide, but there was also a state-sponsored killing machine, and it was built by state legislators. So what they did was to authorize no fewer than 24 separate state militia expeditions against California Indian people between 1850 and 1861, which killed at least 1,340 California Indians. They paid for this by passing 3 different bills in the 1850s that raised over $1.5 million, a huge amount of money at this time in history, both for past and future militia operations. Now, why was this so important? It was important because this policy transcended the number of people that it killed directly, because by demonstrating that the state government would not punish Indian killers, but instead actually reward them, these militia expeditions and the policies that supported them helped inspire huge numbers of vigilantes to go out on their own killing sprees, and they took the lives of, at an absolute minimum, 6,460 California Indians between 1846 and 1873. But you mentioned the Army, so I'll touch on them briefly as well. The U.S. Army and its auxiliaries also killed at least 1,680 California Indian people during these years. And that institution was, of course, directly funded by Congress. But Congress also reimbursed the state of California for most of the money that it spent on Indian hunting through its militias.
Thank you for giving that summary, that horrific history that needs to be told more. I wanted to take a step back and look at the indigenous culture that you speak about as well. And you were saying that between the Rio Grande and Arctic Ocean, there's 300 different languages, and classified into 50 different language families. And you, compared to Europe, you mentioned that in Europe the languages are in 3 families. And to quote you, you say California stands out as one of the most linguistically diverse places on Earth. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about this and the significance.
To me, California on the eve of contact with Europeans is this amazingly exuberant clamor of many different Native American economies, languages, tribal nations, and individuals. And, we know that indigenous people had worshipped and loved and traded and fought in California for at least 12 to 15,000 years. And, of course, many California Indian people believe that time span reaches back to time immemorial. it's a very diverse series of economies. It's very difficult to generalize about them. If we take just cuisine, for example, the cuisines, traditional cuisines of California Indian people vary a great deal. So, for example, if you look at the region west of the Sierra Nevada mountains, one of the keystone foods would be the acorn. But if you go east of the Sierra Nevadas and east of the Cascade Range, it's likely to be the pinyon nut, pine nuts. Political organization is likewise extraordinarily varied, with some tribal nations having systems of inherited chieftaincies. Some of them have one leader or multiple leaders, and it's also very decentralized, so very, very different from what we think of as Anglo-American system of government or way of life. And it's also a very densely populated place. Scholars estimate very conservatively that at the time the Spaniards first arrived in California in 1769 to begin colonizing the land, there were at least 310,000 indigenous people living here, and they're organized into as many as 500 or more different individual political units, individual groupings. So it was a very, very complicated kaleidoscope to look into as a researcher. And even today, it's extraordinarily complex. Just to give the listeners a sense of the lay of the land today, there are 109 federally recognized California Indian tribes, but also scores of other tribes that are not recognized by Washington, D.C., but which are recognized by Sacramento, by the state of California. And then there are many, many other tribes which are recognized neither by the federal government nor by the state government, but who are currently seeking recognition by both. In California, there was quite a lot of devastating termination during the termination era, when Congress would summarily terminate tribal nations as tribal nations, and many of those tribes that were terminated are still struggling to be reinstated by the federal government. I was just 2 weeks ago visiting with folks from the Winnemem-Wintu Nation who were terminated by the federal government and have been struggling for decades trying to be reinstated.
Well, hopefully they do. Thanks for that background.
Sure.
I'd like to ask you about W.E.B. Du Bois and his famous chapter, The Propaganda of History. He speaks about the need to tell the truth about U.S. history. I was wondering, how do you approach writing and teaching history?
That's a good question. Well, I think I can talk a little bit about what motivates me to write about genocide. Genocide poses very high-stakes questions, not only for scholars like me and for students, but also for the descendants of the victims and for everybody living in a nation where genocide has taken place. If I have to think about why I would do this work on the deepest level, well, there are big questions for everybody, but there's also, I guess, some fundamental questions for a scholar. And so the first thing that I would say motivates me is a desire for bringing some decency, basic common decency. And I think that decency demands that even long after the deaths of the victims, we preserve the truth of what befell them, not only so that their memory can be honored, but also to prevent the repetition of similar crimes in the future. Unfortunately, genocide is a scourge of the human experience, and if we don't talk about the genocides of the past, I believe it makes it more difficult to confront the genocides of the present and the future. Mm-hmm. The second thing that I would say motivates me is a desire for justice. And justice demands that even long after the perpetrators have vanished from the face of the earth, we document the crimes that they and their advocates have too often concealed or successfully denied. And finally, as an historian, I am, of course, deeply concerned with the truth. And historical veracity demands that we acknowledge state-sponsored genocides, large-scale catastrophes, in all their varied aspects and causes, in order to better understand what are crucial events in the making of the modern world in which we live.
Thank you. And on top of that, in your book, you're very meticulous about showing every life that was lost that you could document. And along with putting a spotlight on these atrocities, how important is it for you to also tell the story of Indigenous survival, resistance, and self-defense?
That's another great question. Let me take the first part of that question first.
Okay.
So anyone who has ever lost a loved one has grief. And when you think about that grief, and then you multiply it by hundreds and by thousands and by tens of thousands, then you begin to understand why it's so important to document the loss of each and every life. And when I was a graduate student, first working on this back at Yale, I was walking through the rotunda. It's a famous space all in white marble with plinths that record the names of every Yale graduate, women and men, who have fallen in all of the wars that the United States has been involved in, and its British colonial antecedents since Yale began in 1701. And I stood there for a long time one morning thinking, will there ever be a monument like this to all of the California Indian people killed between 1846 and 1873? And I hope that one day there will. But I thought to myself that morning, I can do something like that by honoring the fallen, at least on paper. Mm-hmm. And so in the hardback edition of my book, there are nearly 200 pages of appendices which document every killing of a California Indian person by a non-Indian and vice versa. And so this is my small contribution to creating a memorial, not as spectacular, of course, as Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., but it was my attempt to try to commemorate the fallen. Mm-hmm. And perhaps on a more practical, less philosophical level, I hope that it is a useful research tool for educators, for students, and for tribal citizens who wish to know more about this history, because I list, where possible, the names of the fallen, the date on which their lives were taken from them, where the event took place, and the sources where I found the information. So there's a great deal of data there for someone who is interested in learning more about what happened where they live or with their ancestors, etc.
Yeah, and it's well researched. And as far as resistance in the book, you write. I want to quote you. You were quoting from 1829. You write, by repeatedly burning buildings, killing Spaniards, Mexicans, and their allies, and escaping in large numbers, California Indians established a tradition of resistance to colonialism and helped to pave the way for their own emancipation. And I think really, and is that what your next book is about as well?
Well,
survival?
The next book is a bit different. It's about the gold rush, but it is more about survival and about agency. I mean, what I will say about resistance during the genocide, I'm glad you reminded me of that, is that we don't know a great deal about it because people often lost their lives while resisting. Mm-hmm. And there are many stories in this book of Native American men and women who fought back to buy time for children and elders and loved ones to escape. And many of them made the ultimate sacrifice in order to facilitate those escapes. When we think about the resistance, it was courageous and incredible. And you have to remember that relatively small numbers of California Indians were being pursued by relatively large numbers of state militiamen, regular United States Army soldiers, and sometimes paid scout bounty hunters. And they found incredible ways to resist. So the dark cloud of genocide hangs over California Indian history. And yet, if there is a silver lining, it's that triumph of survival against really impossible odds. It's the preservation of languages and cultural traditions, despite not only the genocide of 1846 to 1873, but the education assault that followed hard on its heels, whereby children were taken from their homes to be educated in boarding schools up and down the state. But there too, Indigenous people resisted. They resisted by withholding their children from enrolling. Children who were enrolled resisted by running away and escaping home, and also, again, by burning down schools, all up and down California. California Indian students set fire to the boarding schools in which they were held. So that resistance continued, and that resistance also was part of the pressure for the impetus for closing some of those schools. Greenville School, for example, when it burned down, never reopened.
Thank you for sharing those stories and that context on that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the labor and the gold rush and slavery of California Indians. And you said in most cases settlers were paid more to kill Indians than to mine gold, often. And with football teams like the 49ers and things named after this is some extremely important context to have.
Right. So I mentioned earlier that first law in 1850, which allowed for the indenture of Indians in California. There was a follow-up law that the state legislature passed in 1860, allowing for the indenture of any Indian or Indians, including prisoners of war. And what those two laws did was not only to effectively grant impunity to would-be slave raiders, but it also set up a system. So there were actual sales of California Indian people conducted by justices of the peace. So, for example, if a California Indian person was convicted of a crime punishable by a fine, and they were unable to pay that fine, a non-Indian person could pay that fine, and then they would have the right to work that California Indian person without any remuneration for a given period of time. So the slave system, as I said before, had these multiple genocidal impacts. The initial onslaughts were often full of lethal violence. The marching of enslaved people to points of sale was often lethal, and then people were often worked in conditions that were just impossible for them to survive once they got to their place of work. But the other thing that was going on was that the slave system was separating women and men during peak reproductive years, making it very difficult for them to reproduce. So there's a whole host of genocidal crimes associated with this. And the other thing that's important to get a sense of is the sheer scale of this web of unfree labor systems. So scholars estimate that in total, between 1850 and 1863, somewhere around 20,000 California Indian people were ensnared in one or more of these systems of servitude. And thousands of those people were children. So children were forcibly taken from their home communities and put into another community, which in itself constitutes a genocidal crime.
And I thought some of the most disturbing stories in this book involved Charles Stone and Andrew Kelsey, who were white colonists in the Clear Lake region, and they were part of the Bear Flag Party, and they were holding Pomo people as slaves. As you mentioned as well, disposable laborers. They had institutionalized starvation. They wouldn't let them hunt or fish. They were hanging people to where only their toes could touch as a form of torture. And you have this story in here of when the genocide really ramped up, and that was after Chief Shook and a group of others rose up and killed them. I was wondering if you could speak about this time and the significance of this era.
Sure. So one of the things that was really important to me about that story is that this is really the turning point toward state-sponsored genocide in California. So before these events took place, killing was fairly sporadic, but this launches, it's the catalyst for the first major extended killing campaign. So once Stone and Kelsey were killed by the Wapo and Pomo people on the shores of Clear Lake, it triggered a cascading series of events. First, a group of vigilantes operating in what is now the Napa Valley and Sonoma County killed large numbers of Indian people. But an interesting thing happened, which was that a counter group of vigilantes arrested these 8 killers and brought them to the U.S. Army, and the Army then put them onto a U.S. Navy brig in San Francisco Bay to be held as prisoners. And they were tried in California's very first Supreme Court trial. But the Supreme Court decided to let all of them off on bail and never pursued actually prosecuting them. Then the U.S. Army launched a series of lethal campaigns between Christmas of 1849 and May 15th of 1850. And in total, this vigilante operation and the 2 California campaigns by the U.S. Army killed 1,000 people or more. And when I was reading about this, I thought that I would find officers involved censured or perhaps court-martialed or transferred somewhere else. But quite tellingly, every officer involved was ultimately promoted. All of them became U.S. Army generals. One of them became the governor of the state of California. So that's a turning point in this genocide because it's the first time that extended Indian killing campaigns are launched, which are then tolerated and or supported by both state and federal authorities.
I'm speaking to you from the homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute in Denver, Colorado. And that was very similar to the Sand Creek Massacre out here, where most of everyone was celebrated. They even had a parade afterwards. Yeah, very similar things. I think that turned into one of the most investigated incidents in the Civil War, though.
Right. This is a little bit different than that, in as much as there was a sense that something went terribly wrong, and there was a congressional investigation. There's no congressional investigation in this case.
On your research, have you seen U.S. policy against indigenous populations used as a precedent for policies that Nazi Germany had implemented? I know they were inspired from the eugenic policy in the U.S. We had spoke about Hitler's reference to Lebensraum. Also, parts reported where Hitler had spoke about Native Americans from North America and that he compared the war they were waging to what North America did against the, quote, Red Indians. He also put a message in 300 copies of Wild West novels by Karl May to all of his soldiers on the Eastern Front. I was wondering if you found any correlations of this in your research.
No, but I do think that the Nazis were quite concerned about American Indian code talkers. And they were concerned because I think they had never been able to break the codes in the First World War, and they were worried that it would happen again in the Second World War.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to go back to your story of where you grew up at Happy Camp in NorCal. the homelands of the Karuk. And I was wondering if you could speak about this experience and the first time you started thinking about colonization and how the narrative of U.S. history that you may or may not have been taught, you were thinking to yourself, maybe this isn't right.
Well, I think I was thinking in this project, which took a long time to germinate, I was thinking more, I think, from a native view of history. I was very curious about whether or not the oral histories that I had been hearing from Karuk and Shasta people about mass murder in their homelands were going to be true throughout the state. And one thing that happened during the research, which was very interesting to me, was I was able to put together the connections between indigenous oral histories and the written archival record. That is to say, I made many different visits to California Indian communities, and elders and knowledge bearers often shared songs and stories with me that I was able to then use as clues to find things in the archival record. So, for example, an older woman at a reservation in northwestern California told me, we have a song about the time when the villages were all on fire. And because she was able to connect it with genealogies, she was able to tell me with a great deal of specificity in what year this song was first sung, because it was connected with a certain person. I then went to the archives at the University of California at Berkeley, and I said to the archivists there, what can you help me to find about eyewitness accounts in the archives from people traveling in what is now Del Norte County between 1850 and 1855. And lo and behold, with some searching, we found Ida Pfeiffer's memoirs. She was a Austrian female travel writer from the time, and she went there. And so I was able to read her travel memoirs in which she describes visiting Del Norte County and seeing many villages on fire there as she was led around by her Swiss guide. So that was one of the really interesting parts of this research, putting together, assembling the connections between a rich indigenous archive, that is, oral histories that are in people's heads and in people's hearts, and connecting those histories to the archival documents, to the written letters, the written journals, the books, the government reports, etc.
That's an amazing story. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Well, I'll say that the visiting to California Indian communities, both within and beyond California, because I visited some in Oregon and Oklahoma as well, was extraordinarily instructive to this project and helped me to avoid a lot of errors and omissions, and that was a very important part of my research.
And you told one story of when you were at one of these indigenous homelands where people burst out in laughter for some of the history that you had researched, that it was wrong or you had misspoke people's names or things like that.
I think maybe this story is out there now. I think the first time that I visited one community on the northwest coast near Crescent City, I showed a picture and labeled it as a man, and that was the one that got everyone laughing because it is a woman. She is wearing a dress. She has tattoos that are only associated with women, and she's wearing a basket hat, which only a female would wear. But this is part of the education of the scholar, is to try to get out of the get out of the university, get out of the archive, get out of the library, and go and put your feet on the ground and meet people and smell the pine needles warming in the sun and look around you at what's really happening that's not printed on paper.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the current climate we're in the U.S. right now, and as a historian who has researched fascism and violence associated with nationalism, as right now we're seeing a rise in right wing across the world, racial epithets, and these things can quickly slip into violence and genocide. And along with that, we're seeing the kids on the border currently who are being imprisoned. And I wanted to quote director and Ojibwe Jesse Wente, who recently, he tweeted a while back, "Colonial states separate children from parents because they know it works. It destroys and traumatizes for generations. It's an attack on the future as well as the present. It's not a partisan issue, it's a colonial one." And I was wondering, as a historian, how you see this current moment and what's going on.
One thing that I believe quite strongly is that there is no safe level of racism.
Yeah.
As you yourself just said, it is a slippery and surprisingly quick ride from casual racism to institutionalized racism to race laws to state-sponsored violence against certain groups and then to genocide. And that's one thing that I feel quite certain about after my decades of study in this field. I do think that, at least for now, we still live in a democracy. And one of the important ways that an educator can combat these problems is by telling the truth about the past. When people begin to understand how this kind of awful, unimaginable history has unfolded again and again around the world, many times in our own lifespans, people, I think, will become more cautious, and they may develop more empathy and a sense that it is a quick link between rhetoric and actual violence.
Yes. And I want to quote James Baldwin before this next question. And he says, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We're unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." And I wanted to bring this to your work and what you found on intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, whether that's to quote you, a connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and suicide.
We can tell the truth, but telling the truth does not bring back the dead. Still, I think we owe it to the dead to tell the truth about history, and we owe it to ourselves. Studying genocide in the history of the United States is not a pleasant process. Most people shy away from doing it, but rather than withdraw from this painful topic, I think we need to move closer to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to help all of us, both Native people and non-Native people, make better sense of our past, our present, and ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about the Civil War and Union soldiers. So a lot of them actually were part of committing genocide and atrocities. And I spoke to you before. I'm in Denver, where the Sand Creek Massacre took place. I was wondering if you could speak on the Civil War and how many don't know that the Union soldiers, and even after the Civil War, battle tactics such as implemented by William Tecumseh Sherman were implemented in the West. And
right.
If you could speak on this history.
Sure. What I can say is about California, which I know quite well during this period. So during the American Civil War, thousands of men in California voluntarily joined the Union Army, and about 7,000 of them remained in California, where they were deployed against California Indian people. So they were called California Volunteers, and they radically changed the killing machine, because before them, killing was carried out either by relatively small vigilante groups or by state militia operations that were limited in scope and had limited budgets. But during the Civil War, these California volunteers, these regular U.S. Army soldiers, were deployed for unlimited campaigns. Some of these campaigns lasted for many, many months, and they had the very best equipment. They had more training, and they were often led by seasoned regular officers. And in California, they carried out multiple infamous atrocities, killing surrendered California Indian warriors on multiple occasions, killing women, killing children. So it's really quite a blot on our history here in California. And not only was this a federal project, but it was also supported by the state of California. California raised a major bond measure in order to pay California men extra money for joining the U.S. military during the Civil War years.
Thanks for sharing that. This is my last question, and it kind of bookmarks where we started. I was looking at the legacy of genocide that we see. I mean, just looking in Colorado, we see street names, county names, town names that celebrate settler colonists who committed genocide. We have Fort Lyon in Colorado, which you detail him quite a bit in your book. And we have Kit Carson County. We have a town named Shivington. And you mentioned all of the legacy in California. And I was wondering, though, what are California indigenous tribes proposing to commemorate these genocides? Even the topic of what reparations should be brought. And I know this should be spoke about by the indigenous community, but based on your research and your conversations, what are your thoughts on this and memorials for indigenous?
That's a really good question. So I think there are multiple tracks to commemoration. One is state-sponsored commemoration. And, of course, here in California, our own Governor Gavin Newsom has recently publicly apologized for this genocide, and he has also called for this genocide to be included in our state public school curricula. So that's one track for education. There have been no major public calls that I'm aware of on a state level for commemoration, but Gavin Newsom did, quite importantly, recently change on a statewide level Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Their commemoration in terms of plaques and monuments tends to happen on a more local level, but there are very few plaques and memorials commemorating massacres in California. And where they are in place, they're often quite controversial, and sometimes an old plaque stands commemorating something as a battle next to a new plaque which commemorates it as a massacre.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you raised a very important point, which is that California Indian communities are themselves commemorating these things, both publicly and outside of the public eye. So there are, for example, candlelight vigils on places like Duluwat Island in Humboldt Bay off the coast of the city of Eureka. Eureka recently gave that island back in its entirety to the Wiyot people. Mm-hmm. There is a candlelight vigil that happens every year to commemorate a huge massacre that took place up in Del Norte County. There are also walks and runs. So, for example, there is a walk that happens each year to commemorate the Concow Maidu Trail of Tears from the area around Chico, moving west toward Round Valley Reservation in southern Mendocino County. So there are a number of different things going on, but of course there's much more that needs to be done. So Kelseyville, which is at the site of the Big Valley Ranch headquarters where Stone and Kelsey lived, those two slave owners, it's quite a painful name for a lot of people. And Pomo folks and Wapo folks up there in Lake County have tried to use ballot measures to get the name of that town changed. That has not yet been successful, but towns named after some of the more obviously genocidal governors from this period have been changed. So it's an ongoing process, but it's something that happens that all of us can be involved in, because at least for now, we're still a democracy. So people can be involved in changing their local education system, and they can also be involved in political movements to change place names.
Mm-hmm. And public history is so important as a historian, because this is where a lot of people just get their history. So having these damaging memorials that call saints battles when they were massacres, a lot of people, they don't go to university, they don't have EBSCO, they don't research these things. This is some of their basic history that you get by going around your city. So.
And a place like the Sand Creek Memorial can be quite important as an educational experience for students and for the public.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Madley, for speaking to me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for your call.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Time Talks podcast. That was Dr. Benjamin Madley. Please support his work. His latest book is An American Genocide, linked in the show notes. Thanks to Awareness for this music. Please rate and share the show, and see you next time.